I'm Eric Feinberg, Chief Marketing Officer here at Essential Accessibility. My entire career has been focused on helping to ensure great customer experience for all people in the world. We know how valuable your time is, and that's why we've made the decision to keep this and all of our webinars to 30 minutes. We'll have time for a live questions and answers session at the end, so please ask questions throughout. Let's meet our main presenter. Kara Zirkle is Essential Accessibility's Manager of Compliance and Training. She has over 17 years of experience working in the disability field and actively advocates for and educates the world about web accessibility, assistive technologies, and the laws that protect individuals with disabilities. She has a strong knowledge of universal design and the importance of incorporating it into educational and work settings. Once again, a big thank you to you, all of you who have joined us today on the 8th official Global Accessibility Awareness Day for our live webinar. Let's get to it. Welcome to the party. Kara?
Thanks, Eric. So welcome, everyone. Let's go ahead and get this started off by asking a polling question. So you're going to have something pop up on your screen, and you're going to be able to select an answer. And once you hit submit, we'll start to show some of those results very soon. So the question is, what's your familiarity with VPATs? And we have, I'm a familiar and reference them regularly. I have heard of a VPAT, but not really 100% sure of what to do with them, or I don't know about VPATs. So we'll go ahead and give this another 20 seconds or so to come through, and votes coming in, and then we'll show the results overall. So while this is actually being done, really when we're talking about VPATs, the voluntary product accessibility template, we're really talking about a checklist essentially around accessibility standards themselves. So when we're looking at this, let's see what the poll results show. So we have about 35% are you're familiar with them and reference them regularly. And then we have about another 31% of you've heard of them, but not really sure what to do with them. And then another equal 35% of you don't know anything about VPATs. So this is really a nice blend of different things. So when we're talking about VPATs, they're really used by buyers to determine how accessible a product is and where there could be any potential deficiencies necessarily on some of these different items. And when we're talking about this, they essentially work as that checklist that we're talking about. But more importantly, what they're doing is they're starting a conversation, because by asking a vendor for a VPAT, it really kind of starts that conversation around accessibility and what it is that you're looking for and why that you're asking. And it really kind of makes them a little bit more aware of what the requirements are, because, you know, more government, state government, and universities are requiring a VPAT to be part of their procurement initiative. But even so, you know, when we're looking at this, the Information Technology Industry Council is really the global group that's behind updating all of those VPATs. And we're currently on version 2.3 that came out in December, but they're really a universal language. So regardless of whether we're talking about Section 508 or WCAG 2.1 or even the Europe standard of EN 301549, the VPAT can answer questions across the board because it really is that universal language. So when we're talking about that, do VPATs apply to you? This is one of the common questions that we get. And really, when we're talking about that, we get it from a corporate company to say, you know what, I really don't sell to government or higher education much. If I do, it's maybe only 15%. So is it really worth it? Because, you know, 15% of sales, not really all that much. Well, corporate companies really, you know, if you're a client of ours, we're training and we're educating our customers to ask for VPATs, regardless of whether it's government, education, corporate, because really the baseline is everyone is purchasing software, whether it's going to be a chat service or a checkout system or something along those lines. So regardless who you really sell to, corporate companies are starting to see it, you know, even if they're selling to someone outside of that education or government. Sometimes you have your financial institutions or e-commerce, hotels. A lot of these groups are also having to use and rely on things like chat or cart and things like, you know, a few things like that. So really, you know, looking at that, the other question we get is, you know what, I'm only asked a couple times a year, you know, is really the return on investment worth it? And in that instance, you know, completing a VPAT is a major test. It's a deep dive. But being able to have that as a checklist, you're really doing it only for your major updates. So if you are looking at version 1 to 1.5, then what's that change management between 1 and 1.5? Maybe it's not necessarily having to do a whole new retest and a new VPAT, but maybe only some updates as a part of a roadmap feature that you can apply to that VPAT. But then when you're looking at version 1 to version 2, that's when you might be looking at a new VPAT. So it's not something you have to do every time. You're not having to have a new VPAT done for every new request. A single VPAT can then go out and be shared with all of the requests. But it is really more on your change management and how updated the system is from one time to another. So looking at that as well is, I don't really have time. I have a hard enough time to really incorporate our roadmap and the updates with the resources we have. To include accessibility is just sometimes too much. What do we do? And in that instance, it's one of those of looking at it around accessibility and how that universal design, you're really incorporating and making your product a better product if you can start to incorporate and look at accessibility. So you might find that it may help with some of those time and resources because you're bettering the product overall. Maybe you yourself rely on third party. And then what do you do? So if you're having your application tested and you have to rely on a third-party cart service, then when we're doing the testing for some of that, we often see to where you have limitations that you need to start asking that other third-party vendor for their VPAT. Because even if you've made accessibility important and a priority that you're working towards, you're only going to be able to do so much until this other system is going to also work towards accessibility. So procurement requirements, we're going to start to see that across the board, whether it's that corporate, government, education. And then finally, what happens if we're not accessible? Won't telling a client that we're not accessible hurt us? And really, the biggest thing is from a client perspective. As a client, I used to be that client perspective before coming to Essential full time. And being upfront with a client and letting them know is really setting a precedence rather than lying to them or, just kind of going through and checking the boxes or things like that. Furthermore, being aware and actually promoting the VPAT documentation that you have done or the accessibility statement that you may have is showing where you actually see accessibility as a priority and allows these clients to be able to go and find it rather than even having to upfront ask the question ahead of time. So think about these things to when you say, does a VPAT apply? So when we're talking about VPATs, there's going to be different levels of accessibility. So we have your supports, your partially supports, and your does not support. Those are your three most common. So when we're looking at this, you might see something that says not applicable. Well, in an instance like this, you might, say videos are part of the WCAG standards, but you might not have any videos on your website or your application. So that could be a not applicable. Or we might have a not evaluated. Sometimes we've seen clients come to us and say, hey, I need a test and a VPAT. It's on Friday and the RFP is due Monday. Well, we might not have time to be able to test that level 3 AAA of WCAG 2.0 or 2.1, whatever that requirement is. So that might be an area that's not evaluated right now. But most of that you'll see as level WCAG 2, and we say 2 so that way it can be used 2.0 or 2.1 depending upon what the client requirement is. Level AA is your most common standard. Testing to AAA is great, but sometimes you might see that not evaluated, and asking the question of why it shows not evaluated versus the supports is always a good question to go back and ask the vendor. So when we're looking at that, what does a sample VPAT look like? So we have here a vendor claims partially supports, but really describes the issue of how they partially support it. So that way, as someone, whether it's procurement, the requester, things like that, they can go and see, okay, it partially supports it, but I know exactly what it will and won't do based upon the remarks and explanations. So even without having a demo, I can get an idea of just how well someone might be able to use this. Whereas if we look at a VPAT that simply says supports, but doesn't provide anything, then if I'm looking at the two and if I would be having to choose, I would much rather trust the vendor that says they partially support and gives all the information around how they do or don't versus a vendor who simply just checks a box, says they support, and provides no additional information to that. So these are some of the things that, and these are some of the challenges that folks will run into, and something to think about when you may be on that end of answering the VPATs to these customers that are asking the questions. So then we have what we consider an ideal VPAT. An ideal VPAT is going to cover your EN 301, your Section 508, your WCAG 2.1. That way you have it out there for all of your clients, all of your customers, regardless of what standard they may look at. And you, regardless of the conformance level of supports, partially supports, does not support, you are actually adding in those remarks and explanations. When I used to be that customer asking for the VPAT, if I would get something that says supports and I didn't have the remarks and explanations, I'd send it back to the vendor and say, you know what, I still need more information. Otherwise, we're going to need a demo to test this on our own, or you might need to go out to a third party and have this tested so we can get more information, because a supports with blank information isn't enough for us to make the decision that we need.
Hey,
So
Kara,
with that,
sorry, Kara, let me interrupt if you don't mind. This is Eric again. There was a great question that came in the Q&A panel, and instead of waiting for the end, it's germane to what you were just discussing. So I'm just going to ask you now, if that's okay.
sure.
The question is, what is the standard format for VPATs? And then the question asker goes on to ask, I do not want to reinvent the wheel if I don't have to. Is it PowerPoint or Excel or something like that? And are those 3 columns all I need?
So when we're looking at a VPAT, really going back to ITIC, they are the ones that have the most updated version and everything, and that is coming in from a Word file. So they have that, and you actually, when you're looking at their website, version 2.3, they have a revision from there, but you also have a file there that shows the change management, which is really important, because if you're looking at a VPAT provided by a vendor, and they may have 2.1, and you know that the 2.3 revised version is out, then what was the change management in that? Is it really enough that you need to go back to the vendor and say, hey, I actually need the most recent VPAT? Or was it maybe some formatting changes and things like that to where it can still be okay to use the 2.1 versus the newest version of whatever that might be out? So stick with the ITIC. It's a Word version. That is the standard format that you need, and also pay attention to that change management. That change management form on their website is really going to be very important when you are on the inside, the end user side of reviewing these VPATs, to see where those changes are and maybe how out of date it may or may not be.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'll also use this opportunity, Kara, to remind everybody to use the or leverage the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to add your questions throughout the webinar, not the chat, Q&A. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. So when we're talking about, who's invited to the party, we are talking about you, the vendor, right now. So let's focus that on any vendors that we might have. And in that instance, we often get a lot of questions around, we update our software so often, how do we keep up? Or, is there enough time to remediate accessibility errors plus update everything else on our roadmap? Or even, what happens if we can't make the product accessible? These are some of the things that we had talked about prior. And then we have you as the customer, so the ones asking for the VPAT. We're saying that they're not really always accurate, and therefore they're not really always helpful. So what do we do? Or sometimes it might be too high level. It's not giving us enough information. One of the ones that I find a lot is, if there's multiple user profiles on an application, let's do everyone a favor and break those down. Because if there's an end user versus there's an admin, if a vendor gives you a single VPAT that tells you the level of compliance for both of those user platforms, then they're essentially potentially bringing down the level of accessibility of their end user because their admin is less accessible. But as you, the customer, not knowing that, you're automatically seeing that the product itself is really a little bit more on the partially or do not support side. Whereas if the vendor would have broken those down, you could have actually seen your end user product actually is fairly accessible, whereas the admin side is a little bit more of your does not support or partially supports. Now, what does that do? That actually allows you to be able to have a conversation around where your needs are, what the prioritization is, and the risk level of the number of users could help you as pertaining to the end user. Maybe you have every user in the company or the education system using that end user product. But if that's the more accessible version, but you may only have a small number of users for the admin, then you might be able to work something out contractually. But those are really kind of looking at that from those different standpoints. And really making sure that the VPAT itself is going to be accurate and as well as complete. So asking for a VPAT to simply get a response from a vendor is really that starting point of the conversation, but it's really more around understanding the accessibility, or the vendor understanding it, or the end user understanding how to read it and get the information from it is the important aspect. So using that question kind of starts things, but then it's the accountability, and that accountability is going to be, ensuring that it's broken down, sometimes having to advocate and ask questions, but then it goes even further into, whether the VPAT, does it have a roadmap? Is there any other applying documentation? Is the vendor willing to share the report, the testing report that went with the product itself? Did they have it? Is it being completed internally? Did they go out to a third-party resource to have that tested? And that kind of brings us into this last group, is the accessibility vendor. So with some of the requirements of those customers asking the question, they won't accept a VPAT that's done internally because there could be a bias. Oftentimes, one of the sales guys are actually answering questions just because they're needing to meet the requirement to make the sale. But do they really understand the development side of things? Probably not. So in that instance, that's where, the vendors will come to the accessibility companies and they'll say, okay, we need a VPAT. Well, that's where the accessibility companies are now becoming the customer's cheerleaders, because we're really telling the vendors the same thing, just from another avenue, that, it takes a deep dive test, about 150 to 200 hours to test an application. And then they're going to get that report that tells them all the things that they need to work on and how to make these recommendations to the changes, as well as the VPAT that has all of the information of those remarks and explanations to give to their customer. Not only that, but also advising based upon WCAG 2.0 or 2.1. 2.1's been out for a year now. So if anyone comes to us and says, hey, which should I look for? Well, you're going to pay the money for the test regardless. So go to 2.1. And then you, as a business structure and business decision, can see, well, let's focus on 2.0 if that's really where you feel like you need to be, and then look at the 2.1 as your secondary. But if not, and this is your first time making changes, go for gold. Go to 2.1, because anything that you're able to do, say color contrast, for example, that's in 2.0 as well as 2.1. So if you're going to make the change once, let's go to the 2.1 level. So we're trying to advocate as well for some of the vendors, so that way we become the customer cheerleaders. But then who's crashing the party? So crashing that party is now you, the customer, requesting the VPAT, because now it's more of, what, the schools, governments, they're asking all these questions around the VPAT. They're asking us an end user versus the admin user. They're holding us to a certain level of compliance, because in reality, these are part of your procurement. You can use the VPAT or the roadmap and tie those to the contract. Sometimes you might require actually having the vendor provide a demo and some of the testing from there. But then you also have the procurement officer who's saying, you know what, I have a set of requirements I need to do to make sure that I'm looking at getting the most accessible product, but I don't know what I'm looking at because it's a VPAT, it's a checklist, and not everything is done the same. So there's no standard, item for me to kind of compare to. So it's really hard for procurement to be able to verify and look at some of these things. And overall, it can sometimes be confusing for, the VPATs to be reviewed and to know whether or not you're really purchasing an accessible product. So then that then raises questions and goes back to that product vendor to say, what does it mean from, compliance, but this is partially, but is that your full product? Is that an end user? Is that an admin? You don't have remarks and explanations. We need that filled out. So then you kind of go back and forth a little bit to where what happens is you have a VPAT process. And our VPAT process here is option 1, you, the VPAT requester. And in that VPAT requester, in that VPAT request, we actually have an internal team. They complete that VPAT, they send it to the customer returns the VPAT with questions, and then the deal can stall. And what happens is, because it's done internal, it could be unbiased, could be not completely created, but it stalls the deal going to that who's crashing the party. And then we have option two. The VPAT is requested, they actually go out to a third-party company. The third-party company goes through and does a deep dive test. They complete the VPAT. They then give that to the vendor, and the vendor can give that to the customer. They can choose to give the report to the customer if they so choose. The customer gets all the information they need to where they're happy with that information to where they can make a decision to hopefully you as a vendor win the deal. And that's really kind of what we're talking about as some of these different features. So to kind of just end all of that, looking at procurement requirements, the question is it really voluntary anymore? And we ask that because, not only is higher education and government, but we also have K through 12. This is a small list of schools that have started to require, VPATs as a requirement. And many of these don't allow them to be done internally. So if we're looking at that, the U.S. government agencies, GSA, is actually starting to use some artificial intelligence to help with the minimum requirements. So let's just say, for example, they have some keywords of VPAT or accessibility and start to use AI to scan through these things. It's going to help them find much quicker whether or not VPATs are going to be detected. So, voluntary is no longer really an option for many procurement policies, but rather it's only an option for whether the vendor chooses or not to complete and actually make the sale. So in that instance, we go back and ask the question, is it really worth having a VPAT? So with that, I want to turn it back over to Eric and see what kind of questions we have coming in.
So many good questions, Kara. Thank you so much. We've got plenty of time for questions, so please input them in the Q&A part on the bottom of your screen. This first one is from Jay. It says, VPATs are generally associated with government contracts. I think this is riffing off of what you were just saying. Do you think in the next few years we will see VPATs pervade the private sector too?
I certainly hope so. I think it's more around your education, and the more that the corporate sector starts to include accessibility as a priority, they too, as long as they're relying on third-party tools, are going to start asking the same questions.
Thank you so much. This one's from Rajesh. How are VPATs used in litigation?
That's a great question. I'm not a lawyer, and I always refer these to our legal department. But at the same time, I will say, when it comes to looking at VPAT, we talk procurement. Procurement can sometimes talk with legal counsel, and legal counsel can work up contractual items. So I wouldn't necessarily answer the question from a litigation perspective, but I could answer it from more of your contractual perspective. Contractually, you can tie things like VPATs and roadmaps to the contract to ensure that the vendor is going to provide you that VPAT or that follow-up roadmap within 30, 60, 90 days. If they don't achieve those roadmap timelines that was tied to the contract, then, is it something that you as a group can come up with a new roadmap timeframe, or is that going to be a void within the contract? That goes back to the legal counsel and the procurement groups of those making those contractual agreements with the vendors.
That's super, totally clear. And for any of you that are asking these questions and are interested in more information, our email addresses are right there. We can always follow up and talk a bit more. We've got lots of questions. Let me just keep going here for you, Kara. This one's from Rachel. I love this question too. VPATs seem to cover the usability of the software, but not necessarily the output. For example, a software may export a PDF that does not meet WCAG 2.0 requirements. How do you know what hasn't been tested, and how do you check for those things when assessing vendors?
That is a great question, Rachel. So that kind of goes back to asking the vendor for additional documentation. In an instance that I would be looking at, say, a document management tool, because that's often you have your management tool as your platform, or maybe even a finance area, and they export this PDF. Well, that's really a feature and it's functionality of the application. So absolutely it should be tested. And in that, part of their limitation may be they're using a third-party tool to export that PDF out. So it's not a easy question to answer, but really the only answer to that is understand the workflow, understand the background, understand what has been tested and hasn't been tested, asking the vendor for those testing documentation, anything else that they can test for that. Because if it is something they all create as a functionality within its tool, then I would still include the PDF as part of that. However, if they rely on a third-party tool to then convert and push that out as a PDF, then that's where they as a vendor have to then start talking to that other third party. And that's a limitation to where you can't be asking for that VPAT, but then it starts to limit the product overall.
Yeah, I think that's a super nuanced but totally accurate answer. When I hear you talk about this in our trainings internally and externally, I think what you're advocating for here is accessibility as part of the total customer experience. And that would include things that are delivered from the product that you're evaluating and the software that you're evaluating, and its output inclusive in its totality. So I just wanted to, given we have 5 minutes left, I wanted to just remind people that they can unmute themselves if they would like to ask a question verbally, if that's a preference for them. Given we are essential accessibility, we wanted to make sure everybody had the opportunity to ask questions however they want. So I will listen at any point and be interrupted happily to take those questions. I do have another great question here for you, Kara, which is, I love this question too. Are products more or less accessible than websites?
That is a really good question. So the way I've seen it from being a customer, used to have to ask for the VPATs. If I would find a company that didn't have a VPAT or didn't know what one was, or maybe needed to look for one online, I would go to their website and use whatever free automated tool. Everyone knows Wave from WebAIM. That's the most common that's being used, and run that on their website, because the reality is it's much easier to make a website accessible than it is an application. And if their website's not accessible, then it kind of gives you a little bit of an insight on where they see as a priority for accessibility and where that might look like as a part of an actual product of an application. So that's one of the ways that I kind of look at it as an insight if I can't get a VPAT or can't get an answer for one of those lines.
Excellent. So Heather asked a question here that I will answer for you and us. Can you send the link to where we can find the most recent VPAT format from that publicly available website? We will add that to our follow-up email, or you can email either of us directly and we'll reply with the link, Heather, no problem whatsoever. Just going to pause for 10 seconds to see if anybody wanted to jump in with a question. 9, 5. Okay. There's another great question here from Brandon. Do you advocate for, well, we're asking you to be a contracts lawyer now. Do you advocate for indemnification clauses as a protection against inaccurate VPATs?
Oh, great question, Brandon. You must be a procurement officer. So the indemnify clause is really the contractual transfer, and it's really a risk between the two contractual parties. So whether it's the government, higher ed versus the vendor themselves. That is a tough question, and I have to say that it's not a black and white answer. It's not a one size fits all. It is something that it's a great idea. Anything that you can do to protect yourself as a customer, then I say go for it. But at the same time, when I say that, it's something that you have to run by your procurement and legal counsel and have all of your, okays and yays versus any nays to do something like that. So it's a very touchy subject. Sometimes by doing so, you might have the vendor walk away. So by thinking about that as well, is that worth it? So you kind of have to ask yourself, it does help transfer the risk between the parties, but it also adds risk on whether or not you might be able to purchase what you want.
Excellent answer. We have 1 minute to go. I'm going to have just a brief closing remark here and then we'll split. Jesse has a great question here too. Jesse, if you could copy and paste that into an email to either of us, we'll certainly reply to you. It's an excellent question about retailers and the reluctance of vendors to commit to being accessible. Kara, thank you so much. You are awesome. The webinar was great today. We have our promise to always keep at 30 minutes. And so we're there. The webinar today will be recorded and shared, and we'll send an email with follow-up instructions about how to download and replay the webinar. If you have any questions, please email either of us directly or info@essentialaccessibility.com. The purpose of Global Accessibility Awareness Day is to do this very thing, is to get everyone talking, thinking, and learning about digital access and inclusion. I think we accomplished our goal today. So happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you all.